They have oftentimes a short-term sales
You said
target.
oftentimes.
Yeah, oftentimes.
So this is your buzzword. You say, I think I say obviously all the time.
Yeah.
Yours is oftentimes.
Which is a way more sophisticated word. Quite often, or oftentimes.
Welcome to Truth Lies and B2B Tech, the podcast that separates hype from reality when it comes to B2B marketing, sales and service technology. Join me, Craig Taylor, and my co-host James Ingham. Both of us have spent our working lives in the world of complex B2B sales, always trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. Along with our incredibly smart special guests, we'll cut through all the bullshit to bring you proven approaches that will help improve how you go to market. Enjoy the show.
Today we're going to talk about the challenge of generating new business. We'll talk about a lot of the conversations we have regularly with frustrated CEOs that their number one challenge typically is what they would term it as lead generation, but really, I don't think we like the term lead generation as we'll explore through this podcast. But we want to talk about the challenges of generating new business, the challenges of growing pipeline, and why there is this frustration and there's this sort of short-term mindset that doesn't really marry with the realities of how people buy. Mm-hmm. So let's start with this frustration. I think, speak to a lot of CEOs and they're just embarking on marketing and they can be starting from very different places. So, just in the last few weeks, I've spoken with a CEO that's running a business that has never really invested in marketing, and they're already at sort of £30 million mark in terms of revenue. Most of their work has come from referrals, but they now need to go beyond that, and they need a really effective, formalized marketing program. And then on the other extreme, another CEO that's a startup but recognizes they want to take a SaaS product to market. They recognize they want to get go beyond referrals very, very soon. They've got very, very ambitious, demanding growth targets, so they want that whole process from day one. But in both scenarios, when we've talked through the realities of what they're facing. There's a real frustration. Does it have to take a long time to do this? Is it really this complex? And I think that generally a lot of organisations or leaders that don't understand marketing have this frustration that they think it's a short-term fix.
And you can understand why that impression may be, or that attitude may be one that prevails, because ultimately with targets on your back, with growth ambitions, the last thing you want to hear is it's going to take 12 to 18 months to really get the marketing machine working in the way that you want it to, because you need growth today. So it's no wonder that attitude prevails. But obviously the impact of that, and we'll come on to talk about this now, I think, is the short-termism that creeps in then into the action that those leaders take, particularly around sales and marketing.
I think when they start to get into the conversation and really think about the reality of what they're dealing with, it's a dawn of realization and a gradual acceptance, and then coming through that, a more sort of realistic approach and a more realistic set of expectations come from it. So, but we're talking about complex B2B sales here. We're not talking about transactional sales, low value sales. We're talking high ticket, 50,000 plus deals. We're talking multiple stakeholders involved in a formal buying group. Consensus decision making, long sales cycles, maybe 6 to 12 months, if not longer. A lot of risk in terms of the decision from the buyer, not just the organisation or risk, but also individual risk. If you appoint a new partner or you bring in a new product, if it fucks up, it's on you. And so there's a lot of challenges around that. There's a great book out at the moment called Jolt, which is from the authors of The Challenger Sale. They talk about the fact that most sales opportunities, I think it's something like 40-50%, don't go anywhere because of this indecision, and a lot of that is born out of the fact that people are scared of messing up.
And there's a lot of risk of that, not also because of the fact that often what's been bought is a complex thing. There is services which have a complex element to them that also needs to be understood in order to make the right decision. So there is an inherent complexity in these processes.
Yeah.
So to apply a simplistic view of sales and marketing is clearly at odds with the actual reality of the way that people buy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of the outdated mindset it stems from maybe how things used to work many years ago when, obviously when the internet was around, but the proliferation of content over the last 10 years has moved the control of the buying process from the seller to the buyer. So Dan Pink famously talks about this in many of his books, and this whole kind of, which I think he calls it information asymmetry, where you move from a world where as a buyer you're starved of information, and take for example buying a car. You can't find information about the car, so naturally you'll go to a dealership, onto the forecourt. Stakeholder salesperson will take you through how the car functions and all the benefits of that particular car, take you for a spin, etc. That doesn't happen now. There's so much of information available. It's flipped to the buyer has the opportunity now to go through a significant part of their buying process without even speaking to a salesperson. Today it's even gone further than that. Again, reference that to the book Jolt, where buyers are actually overwhelmed with information. There's too much information. So as a seller now, just providing information isn't enough. You've got to help them think through the process.
And as it relates to B2B complex sales processes, the challenge that those that apply the short-termism or the short-termist view have is that ultimately, as a result of not understanding that process, they then don't provide the right level of content or information and make it accessible to those which are in that early stage of the buying process. And of course, what that means is that quite often, or oftentimes, there is that information.
We should keep a scorecard for every time we come out with one of our
James's bingo. So
yeah.
Therefore, that content doesn't exist. It's not being provided to the buyer. And in most markets, there are several people that do the same thing.
Yeah,
a buyer's simply going to get up, or in this case, get off your website and go to somewhere where they can find that information without having to speak to a salesperson.
Yeah.
So you've lost the opportunity to engage with someone at that early stage in the process. And if they're only coming to you at a point whereby they've already done a lot of that research, they've already consumed a lot of content, consumed a lot of information from other providers through, and we can probably talk about how that can be done in practical terms through thought leadership content, buyer enablement content, etc., which we'll come on to, then those people that have provided it have stolen a march on you already, and you're at a distinct disadvantage if you're already at that point. In fact, most of the time, you're probably only there to make up the numbers in an RFP process or some form of competitive process. So I suppose the point really is that mindset needs to shift.
Yeah, well, quite often when I'm having these conversations,
oftentimes
even, I'll talk about the 95-5 rule. For anyone watching, listening to this that doesn't know what that is, it was some research done by the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, Professor John Dawes, I think it was, and I think they work with LinkedIn as well, and extensive research about how buyers buy, and I think what they concluded was it's common sense, logical. The vast majority of your market, your addressable market, is not in market. They're not buying. So 95% of your target audience is fairly dormant, not active, and only 5% are actually in buying mode. And I think the research I don't think it was necessarily targeted at B2B. I think it was B2C and B2B. I think there's a lot of maybe critics of it. It is too simplistic, and I think it is for complex sales. I think there is definitely, if you think about the concept of the research, is essentially saying that 95% of your market is inactive, and therefore you need to really just focus on brand awareness, so that when consistent brand awareness, making them know you, be more familiar with you, and when they're ready to buy, they will. You are therefore top of mind.
There's some truth in that, though.
There is some truth in that. And then with the 5%, obviously they're in buying mode. And if you only engage them when they're in buying mode, and you haven't had that luxury of influencing them and making them aware of you when they're inactive, by the time they come to market, others will have done that. And therefore, you're not going to be in a position where they know your brand. And therefore, you're probably going to be on the back foot back to your earlier point. So, but I think where it's too simplistic is I think there are a percentage, whether you could say 10, 15%, maybe somewhere in that 95 that could be influenced to go to market. I think where it really depends on the product, depends on the service.
And their situation.
But, where it's probably more applicable is something like CRM. So if you've bought a CRM product and you've invested in that, it's likely that you've signed up to a 2-3 year contract.
And or committed resources to...
Absolutely. And it's unlikely that you're going to switch provider during that period unless something horribly goes wrong or there's another trigger point such as your organization is acquired or whatever. So, but I think there are opportunities even in that where, let's take the example of a website, for example. You could say the same thing. Someone's just revamped their website and you'd assume that they may not do anything with that then for another, well, certainly not a major overhaul of their website for maybe another 12 to 18 months. But as we know, a recent organisation spoke to us about exactly this scenario. They just revamped their website, spent an awful lot of money with a website provider, but quite quickly realised that it really wasn't set up to support their buyer journey. And they've now engaged us to help them with that particular part of it. Through education, through thought leadership, they recognised an issue. And, that sort of flies in the face of the 95-5 rule. There's still an opportunity through thought leadership, along with awareness, to maybe influence people that have issues and they're on that cusp of buying, and you can just maybe push them over the edge a little bit into the buying mode. So I think when it's complex sales, I think there's still an opportunity. And again, back to the Jolt book, more successful organizations that are able to sell successfully in a complex sale are doing so by breaking up their offerings and working through proof of concepts or audits or smaller pieces of work to get a foot in the door, build trust, and work directly with the client until the bigger opportunities
something
come
that's
through.
easier to buy.
Yeah, because it minimises the risk for the clients making some big commitment. They can do so gradually, prove the case, get comfortable with the organisation they're working with, etc., etc.
They may not need to go through the same procurement processes. They may not have the same number of people involved in having to make a decision of that scale, etc. And obviously, those businesses doing that are successful not because they're selling those services, but because they're building trust through those services that then leads on to an opportunity later down the line.
Yeah.
And of course, if even better than engaging with someone earlier on in their sales process, getting them to become a customer early on in the sales process with this smaller piece of work that is a small piece of the pie is an even better way of building trust with that organisation with one eye on the bigger opportunity at the end of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people, business leaders, sales leaders, will want to avoid that. We enter at the RFP stage. I remember back in the day, when I was gainfully employed, we'd often qualify out if we had no prior engagement or no early engagement with the prospect. If it was a case of we've come in at RFP stage, no relationship, no real understanding of the business, you just column fodder. You're not really in a good position to win that particular.
You're what fodder?
Column fodder. Never heard that phrase.
No, I thought it was cannon fodder.
Solution selling from Nick Rackham. So
column fodder.
So you're basically making up the numbers.
Right.
I don't know what column fodder actually means, but in its literal sense, but you're making up the numbers basically. So quite often you'd qualify out in that scenario unless you can change the rules of the game somehow.
And there's two examples there of where an organisation might go wrong. Two practical examples if they're not led by their buyer journey. The website being one of them, the sales process being the other. Almost everything that you deliver from a sales and marketing perspective, in my view, I suppose in our view, should be based upon and aligned with that buyer journey.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's what we're trying to get to today, isn't it? To point back towards that fact that most people don't even understand their buyer journey, never mind optimize their systems, processes, strategies to align with that buyer journey. And so that's the starting point, isn't it, for people to...
Yeah. I think why that may be scary for some people is it requires a level of sophistication in in certainly marketing and sales that they're not comfortable with, or think can be achieved. Where it can, if you start to break it down into stages. And I think you have to look at each individual stage of the journey. And I'm not just talking about when someone's entered the buying process, but when they're in that kind of status quo, inactive mode, right the way through to post-sale, when you're trying to move a new customer into being an advocate for the business and promoting the business to generate referrals and all the rest of it. That really is the end-to-end customer journey that organizations should be looking at, breaking down each stage and thinking about how engagement, conversion can be improved at each stage, how you can make sure you're making it easy for buyers to move to that next step. And to give you a real basic example of back in the day, again, I was asked to take over a role as a sales director and really naively used the standard forecasting process, standard deal stages. You've got initial qualification, then you go to discovery, then qualification, then you probably go to a couple of steps before proposal, etc. And my forecasting approach was largely based on asking the salespeople in the team where each deal was and when it was going to close. That didn't work out too well, and I was getting hammered for my forecasting because everything was always late or delayed. I think I came across a bit of research from Bob Apollo from Inflection Point, who definitely recommend as an expert in the complex B2B sale. He's published loads of great content. And this was a number of years ago, but he talked about flipping the sales process and how you forecast to actually match the buy journey. So, and a good example of that is, proposal stage is typically a stalwart in most sales processes. But a proposal, as you know, someone could ask for right at this early stage of the proposal of their buying process, just to get an indicative idea of how much it might cost before they take a business case internally. But in most deal stages, that's going to feature quite late on, maybe at 60, 80% or something like that. So when we flipped it to something more like business case, which is more likely to be the end of the process, our forecasting started to improve. And I think if you can start to think about that in all of your different marketing activities and start thinking in the same mindset where you're flipping it to how the buyer actually buys, then you start to see that you can be more effective.
Yeah, and if you flip that from an inward looking to an outward looking perspective, because ultimately that is a good example, and I'll come on to one around tech in a second, but ultimately if you're establishing those stages about what you want to happen, very rarely is that also going to be what the buyer wants to happen. And naturally, of course, the buyer's in control of that process. They decide when the next stage happens. They decide if they're going to sign a proposal. They decide if they want to work with that company. So that they do sit in the driving seat. So if you have an inward-looking view of the stages and in the order in which you want to happen, then of course it's going to fall down.
It's exactly right. It's built on what you want. You want it to be a very short, linear process, moving through the funnel. Every encounter, you move them to the next stage. But it doesn't happen like that. And you don't, it's very linear because, and this is the real point, on the buyer side, it's really complex as a buyer. You've got to establish that there is a real problem before you embark on any kind of buying project. You've got to feel pain. Got to think that moving away from the current approach is worthwhile. And there's a lot of risk associated with that. People like to keep things as they are. There's lots of different stakeholders involved in decision with different objectives, looking for different outcomes. You've got to get everyone on the same page and reach a consensus. You've then got to evaluate different options, different solutions. Then you've got to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of different potential suppliers. And I think because there's so much information available now, there's always this feeling that maybe there's something else you've got to review before you make that decision. It's a really and when there's so much money at stake, when you're talking big ticket deals, this is going to be a lengthy process and it might go back and forth. There's going to be curveballs along the way. And if you've got everything set up in a linear process, it's just going to lead to disappointment.
But I think for those that are able to flip that mindset around and look at the buyer journey and map it and understand it, it can then be so useful because it can be applied to almost everything you do from a sales, marketing and customer service context. So you mentioned one example around the website that you can apply the buyer journey analysis or understanding to. We've mentioned there around the sales process that you can adjust it to. We talked about content as well, actually, and we'll probably spend a bit more time on that, but technology as well, and how your systems are set up to enable that buying journey is also really key. So a good example recently from a client project whereby they were changing their organization so that their buying process ultimately was changing. They were targeting a new type of customer. The natural first step, and by the way, this was a HubSpot project, but the natural first step then was to understand how that customer buys. That customer buys in a very different way to their existing customers. And ultimately, therefore, their systems weren't set up to support that kind of journey. In short, they were going to get more volume, which is slightly the opposite of what you might expect in a more complex sale. But if you looked at it the other way around, then ultimately the principle is the same. The buyer was buying in a different way, and their existing systems weren't set up to do that. So the natural first step for us was to understand that buying process, and then we could build the HubSpot system, including how leads were handled, including how they were then handed off to different parts of the sales team, different elements of the automation that were built into that process, etc., could all be mapped then to the way that they buy, and the different functionalities and features within HubSpot could be mapped to the areas in which they might be useful within that buying journey.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So the point of that, and there's an argument with content as well, that you can, as you talked about earlier, thought leadership content being able to map to different parts, buyer enablement content to later stage in the process. The point really is that if you are able to flip that mindset, then almost everything you do from a sales and marketing and service perspective can be made more effective by using that as a tool in which to assess how something is done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in that example, it's a brilliant example because you've got an organisation that would traditionally have this very, I say intimate because I can't think of a better word, but this kind of white glove approach to selling, where it's, even the business leader gets involved and it's very personal.
Yeah.
Which can be done when you're dealing with a smaller number of bigger deals.
Yeah.
But when you're moving, like you say, to a more volume-based model with much smaller deals but high volume, that white glove approach is just not going to work.
No, well, you can't scale.
You can't scale it. So you have to bring in ways of automating and making the process easy for the buyers to buy without so much intervention from human beings, individuals in the business, which exactly, illustrates the point perfectly of what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, yeah, because ultimately what we're talking about here as well is complex B2B sales processes, which is where this is more important because by nature they're more complex. That therefore they need to be better understood. But that example shows you that whatever industry the people that are listening to this, the few people that might be, are in, that same approach can be applied.
Yeah, you've got to match your go-to-market activity and strategy to
whatever buyer journey or whatever buyer journey that you have.
That you have to deal with. And I think when you can break it into stages, so you've got that sort of early stage, out of market stage, a lot of that is about nurturing thought leadership, brand awareness. Then when they move, they may, and content is the same. You can even create content that may be focused on various trigger points. So I think we worked for a global payroll company, and I think we recognized that one of the trigger points for a new global payroll project where an organization may look to bring together all its different countries and their local payroll into one more global solution. Quite often the appointment of a global payroll manager was the trigger point for that to happen. And so we created a guide for the first 90 days for a global payroll manager, which, so anyone that's interacting with that, they've just come into that role. That's a great signal of intent for that organization. And we should probably talk about metrics as well, because I think metrics is really important. Again, there's this desire for a sugar rush of, high volume of leads coming through. It makes people feel more comfortable. And there's, we've generated loads of leads and we're just sifting through them. And actually, when we work through them, we actually find that very few of them are in market, and then again, going back to the earlier point, if they are in market, we're probably too late anyway.
Yeah, and sometimes the problem with that is that if they're brought into the sales process too early, i.e. they're not in market, they might have engaged with one guide or one webinar, we consider that a lead. Yeah. And then someone starts hammering the phone and pestering them via email. Ultimately,
and you turn them off.
it's completely the right. Once again, it's about understanding the right strategy, the right tactic to deploy, depending on where that person is in the buyer process.
Yeah.
And if they've engaged with one piece of content on your website, it's not likely that they're in the latter stages of a buying process.
No.
There needs to be more that happens in order for you to get that impression.
And they've got to build trust with you. And we've got an example of an actual deal that went through an 18-month process where the particular contact engaged around 20 to 25 times with different content, different touch points. And we could see that they were sharing content with other people in their organization. Eventually, despite, attempts from the BDR to get in touch with them, which never worked, they could never get hold of them. They actually came as an inbound lead, and now they're one of our clients' biggest clients. So I think going back to metrics, and again, another conversation recently, a client was looking at their reporting. It's very much a case of we generate this many MQLs, and this many MQLs have gone to a sales qualified opportunity, and it's nonsensical, really. It doesn't. We really should be looking at engagement, and are we engaging on a regular basis with a particular organisation? Are we engaging with multiple stakeholders in that organisation? Are we finding signals of intent that might determine where they are in the buyer journey? If we can start measuring those sorts of things, we're going to get far closer to where we want to be.
Yeah. And, by nature, a lot of the people that are running businesses that have complex B2B sales processes, often they do sit within a fairly niche marketplace. And so quantity is really a losing game anyway.
Yeah.
Because ultimately you're going to see diminishing returns eventually. If you want to generate 1,500 MQLs a month and you just pluck that out of the air arbitrarily, and your target market is 1,000 organizations, then very quickly you're going to find that A, you're not going to be able to reach that measure, but B, you're going to see diminishing returns because people are going to be engaging over time.
It goes back to that 95/5 rule, where again there's some flaws with that, because people take a one-size-fits-all approach to the go-to-market across the whole of their target market, and they're just looking for that 5%, just only interested in that 5% that are buying right now.
And
so
sometimes
they discard all those others and just say, well, they're not ready, so I'm not interested in nurturing them and building brand awareness. We just want to focus on that 5%.
Which neglects the 95.
Yeah.
Which is obviously a massive missed opportunity.
Which will be your buyers of the next 6 to 12 months.
Well, not if you treat them like that. They'll be someone else's.
Yeah, but potentially they could be, because they will come to market at some point. And also, you may be able to even influence them if you've got thought leadership, which is why I think it's important to distinguish between brand awareness and thought leadership. Because brand awareness is just brand awareness, making people aware of your brand. So thought leadership goes to the level where you're demonstrating expertise and you're providing a view of how you would solve particular solutions that prevail in the market that you work in, and demonstrating some sort of superior, maybe sometimes even controversial opinion.
Well, it's not just that either, is it? I mean, if you're going to discard that 95, then you're left with the 5, and that's assuming that you have a big enough reach to reach all of those 5,
which you won't have.
So you're really talking about 1 or 2%. And 1 or 2% of anyone's target market, particularly in a very niche market like the ones that B2B organizations have, particularly when they're complex, is small anyway. So you're talking 1% of 1,000. Obviously, you're talking what, 10? 10 organizations.
Your math's probably better than mine.
And you can't do 1% of 1,000. That's embarrassing.
I'm just going.
Is it 10?
Glazed over.
Anyway, the point is, if you're talking 2% of a 5% of organizations that are in a buying process, and you're only targeting around 1,000 organizations anyway, which a lot of complex B2B service-orientated businesses are, then what are the chances if you landed on one of those 10%, and then just at the right time for you to be involved in their process, and then them choosing you? It whittles you down to such a small amount of potential opportunity.
Happen, but I think the expectation is that should be happening every week, every campaign, that you're always going to consistently generate that. It does happen, but it's the exception as opposed to the rule.
But you can see when you think about those numbers why it so infrequently happens.
Sometimes you'll stumble across something. You got us at the perfect time. We're just starting to look at this, but you've still lost that opportunity to build awareness and give them that, establish familiarity and trust with them over time before they've got to that point. It's all about early engagement. You're going to stand a far better chance in actually winning the deal ultimately if you've got that early engagement.
But we've got to be clear about that. What we don't mean is getting the salesperson engaged with them early.
No.
What we mean is them engaging with you as a brand, with your content, whether it's top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel, or any form of engagement with you, but not necessarily directly with the salesperson.
Well, the real point is value the 95, value the engagement, because they are going to be potentially the customers in the future, or your customers of the future. I think let's sum up.
Pretty easy to sum this one up, isn't it?
Over to you.
Understand your buying journey and everything you do from a sales and marketing perspective. Consider that buying journey within it.
Yeah.
It's an easy thing to say. It's more difficult in practice. It's definitely more difficult in implementation. But as we've talked about, the benefits of doing so are really, really clear.
Yeah. Break up your buyer stage or buyer journey by the different stages, and then start to think about what you can do across your website, how you can develop a content strategy that really meets the different information needs at each stage. Think about how the technology underpins all of that. Think about how reporting works and all that. Think about how you align with the sales team. But that's the starting point. Map out your buyer journey and break that into stages, chunk it up, and then start to think about how you can optimize all those different parameters.
Good.
Bosh.
Thanks for joining us. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to our podcast on your favourite podcasting channel. And if you enjoyed this episode, then do us a solid and leave a review and a rating. If you want more insights and resources, head over to romy-associates.com. We'll see you next time.